In our consideration of optimism, we framed the question a little bit differently at this phase to emphasize an element of perspective. For many of the traits that we're discussing, we can self-assess those, we can do some surveys, and we can really think about how we feel or how we self-diagnose along the different areas. Optimism is one that is often better categorized by how other people see you and by other people's opinions of you. So when we think about optimism, we framed it a little bit differently in that do other people characterize you as an optimist? What this also is going to lead us into is a discussion of bias, and we'll talk about some of those biases and the optimism bias in this session as well. So today we're going to look at optimism in the context of entrepreneurial mindset, explore the impact of optimism on the success of entrepreneurs, and we'll also assess your personal optimism. So for definitions, a textbook definition for optimism is to anticipate the best possible result, the optimum result. Now with that, I think there are many optimists out there that define themselves as optimists and other people see them as optimists, not necessarily because there's always the optimum expectation, but because there's the inclination to anticipate a favorable outcome. So we differentiate favorable from best, and that the ideal outcome may not occur, but if you're an optimist, you do expect that the outcome will be favorable. So we'll operate essentially within the second definition of favorability when we think about optimism. Does it matter? We find yes, and we find it over and over again in studies that are out there. A Metropolitan Life Insurance Company was subject of a study where the sales agents that were more optimistic sold dramatically more than those that were pessimistic. So the more optimistic half of sales agents in the study sold 37% more than the pessimistic half. When you looked at a further stratification of the segment, the most optimistic 10% sold 88% more than the most pessimistic 10%. So those that were at the top of this optimism scale outsold those at the bottom by almost double, a dramatic difference. The Princeton Penn longitudinal study looked at elementary school students. They found that even at the third grade level, those that were pessimistic battled depression. Those that were optimistic either never got depressed or recovered very quickly. Further studies at West Point, the U.S. Army Academy, looked at pessimism as an indicator of success and completion of the degree at the university. They found that this measure of optimism was a greater influencer of a cadet's likelihood of graduating from the university than SATs or high school grades. And we found similar results when we looked in athletics in the U.S., in our baseball and in our basketball associations, that the athletes that scored higher in optimism evaluations performed better and had more success. So in a variety of segments, in professional settings, in academic settings, in sports settings, we see that optimism matters, and those that are optimistic have better outcomes. Now there is a bias to be aware of. Both in neuroscience and social science, we see that the individuals are generally more optimistic than realistic. We underestimate our chances of divorce or losing a job or having disease. We overestimate the likelihood of our children being very gifted, of what level of wealth or even what lifespan we're going to have. So we tend to have certain biases there, and that's the subject of this TED Talk. So what you've seen here is an introduction to the topic of optimism and optimism bias, and we have linked to the site within the Canvas modules, and so you can go back and view the talk in its entirety after our talk today. Now there are pros to optimism. It enables entrepreneurs to try new things. It enables entrepreneurs to attempt the difficult and attempt things that we may feel we don't have the right education or experiences for, but we're willing to try anyway. We think that we can have a favorable outcome, and we'll make a go of it as entrepreneurs if we have this optimistic outlook. Optimism can also be contagious. If we're optimistic, it tends to influence our team to be optimistic, our partners, our investors that share in our enthusiasm and share in our excitement. It's also important to say that there are cons to optimism and cons to being unrealistically optimistic. We may overlook critical elements because we want to dive right in. We may discount uncertainties that were we to do a little more research, a little more analysis, we could be better prepared. We accept undue levels of risk, or higher levels of risk than we may need if we are over-optimistic on certain scenarios. This can also contribute to excessive business losses or complete failure of the venture. And so with that, we introduce these cons as somewhat of a cautionary tale that while we are champions of being optimistic, we don't want to necessarily suggest that we should be unplanful and that we should not do our research and that we should not be strategists. So we seek balance. With that balance, we want to think about the relative cost of pessimism versus the benefits of optimism. We want to recognize the importance of balance and understanding the relative levels of powers and influence of both. And we want to think about, how do you do that? How do you get on this path? And Seligman, through learned optimism, has done a lot of work in this space, and so we're going to highlight some of the principles and key takeaways that he suggests. The first step is to learn to identify situation and events that we routinely face, to document them, to think about the challenges that we encounter, to then learn and to record, to write the beliefs, the assumptions, what comes to mind, what do we expect, some separation of the facts from our feelings, and to have a more objective view and objective account of what it is that we're facing. The third step is to think about consequences, to think about the levels of emotions and energy and what's happening and what we did, and then to think about what were some of the elements that may dispute what we're seeing. And there might be a little bit of a devil's advocate of thinking about, well, what else might have happened? What might we have missed? What else could have influenced this? And so we look at evidence. We think about alternatives. We consider other implications. Again, documenting these elements. And lastly, we think about the level of influence of energy and beliefs over time. We think about how these elements of emotions and feelings, be it of a pessimistic or of an optimistic nature, have influenced the decisions that we've made. Have we encountered something that was an initial hurdle, but because we felt that it was difficult, we stopped? Or we performed at somewhat of a lackluster level? Or inversely, if we thought that it was difficult, but we were going to give it our full go anyway, and we put in our full effort and our full attention, what was the outcome then? So this is a way of essentially building and developing optimism and understanding what some of these root causes of pessimism may be as well. So we'd like for you to do the optimism evaluation of visiting the link, completing the evaluation, printing results, and posting them online. And a key element that's true of optimism, as well as all of the different areas that we've examined within our entrepreneurial mindset and motivation and behavior lectures, are that we can learn, unlearn, and relearn. With that, our outlook and many of these characteristics and behaviors that we've discussed are influenced by our experiences, and that we have the capacity to learn things as individuals, to unlearn and to relearn. And that's true of emotional behaviors and psychological patterns. And in that sense, when we begin to understand who we are and what we are, it gives us the opportunity to enhance and redevelop ourselves. So in summary, the optimistic with a high reality testing is essentially the ideal balance. And that's what we mean by seeking that balance. We don't want to be unduly optimistic, nor do we want to be pessimistic. So we don't want to fool ourselves into thinking we can do things we aren't yet prepared to do. But we do want to focus on positive options and become an optimist in the context of thinking about how to move forward and how to be optimistic as entrepreneurs. Also within this element, we want to emphasize our capacity to learn, to unlearn, and to relearn. And that's true of optimism, and that's true of the other facets and factors that we've been discussing to date.